Hey guys, in this video we'll cover what is CICD. Of course, for those of you who know it, it's really simple to understand, but those of you who don't, it's a really complicated topic, right? So please pay attention. There's a lot to cover. I'm gonna go through the entire process, how are things done in the old ways and the new ways and the tools you can use, what are pipelines and how we really get this to work. Again, pay attention. So let's get to it. Okay guys, before we get started, I want to point out that one of the reasons why I'm going through these tutorial sets, especially around Jenkins and the DevOps and CICD, is because of this post I've posted on my LinkedIn, which got a lot of responses. Eventually, all the way webinar will kind of go over a complete setup. I'll see if it's gonna be a webinar or actually a video, which then I'll just post it on my LinkedIn. If you're not connected with me, feel free to reach out. I am always, I always welcome new connections. But the bottom line is, I do want to see comments and likes. So let me know how you like this, what I missed out on, or what else you would have liked to see, so I can kind of include that in my next videos. But again, there's a lot to cover. The only thing I ask is, to stop the video, pause it anytime you don't understand something, or take notes. This is what is CICD. It's kind of an introductory topic on CICD, so it's not a lot, but the follow-up videos, which we'll do on the complete Jenkins and complete setup of Jenkins for CICD pipelines, those will need a lot more notes taking, right? So pay attention. So let's get to it. So what is CICD? Also stands for continuous integration, continuous deployment. Some call it continuous delivery. You can call it however you want, but we want to explain this process because, if you don't know it, and I still come across to a lot of organizations who still follow the ancient ways of doing things, right? And we'll cover that as well. But CICD, what is CICD? CICD is meant to be automation, right? So if you love automation, if you love automating things, you kind of have to implement this, right? There's no other way. Imagine if you are working on an application. I'm sure some of you are in these situations where your manager or your business wants to see those updates, so they'll kind of reach out to developers every now and then. They'll say, hey, we know what's going on. Let's see the next version. So you have to kind of stop what you're doing if you are a developer and go on and do a build and manually deploy. And so we'll kind of cover that process. But basically, if you are a large organizations, you might even have teams of people who are like called release engineers, who just, that's their full-time job, to really take the code and deploy it, right? So that's why this idea of automation was born, and the label for it is CICD. And there's bunch of tools to use. I'm in favor of free open source, Jenkins, GitLab's, other ones. But of course, nowadays, Amazon offers it, Azure offers it built in. There's a lot of tools for automating, using, for implementing CI/CD pipelines, right? So it is a best practice. If you are a developer, you kind of also have to know this, because, the trends are moving in a direction of not only you have to be a full stack developer, but also understand the DevOps side of things, because some organizations just don't have the resources to spin up a DevOps team. So you will kind of be responsible to kind of set this up as well. So let's get to it. So first of all, what is the manual process? How are people doing it currently? And I'm sure if you have the experience, you know this, but let's just go through this real quick. So you start with coding the application, right? You do your coding, developing, and you're done. You get to a milestone where you want to kind of show it to someone, or you want to deploy it, right? So what do? You do a build, right? So you do like a release build, whatever that takes. You do a release build to create a package, which then you take that package, you go to the destination server, whether it's dev or production or somewhere else. and you manually copy it over, right? That's kind of the bottom line. To simplify things, you create the package, you manually copy over. Fun stuff, right? So imagine if you have to do this every week or every hour in a day. It gets really annoying, right? If you are a developer or even like a release engineer, either way, it's a tedious task. No one wants to do. There's a lot of errors in between, right? If you forget to copy a config file to a production environment, you can like break the code. Or if you're somehow forget when you build something, you forgot to include something, it just is a lots of errors, right? So a lot of times there's a lot of human error involved. Some organizations actually have tools of asking people to create all these step-by-step process so that someone can take this package and deploy, and even then they miss some things and they break the production and so on and so forth. So long story short, you want to avoid manual deployment. I know it's work, it's something else you have to learn, but it's necessary. So stop what you're doing, start learning this, because it is a must-have nowadays. So what's next? So to understand how CICD works, first you really need to understand source control as well, because unbelievably, believe it or not, some organizations still don't have source control implemented, or they might have like some ancient system. I don't know how they keep track of what is source control? Source control is like a versioning, right? Versioning of your application. So if your code changes, you want so you make code changes, right? You want those changes to have a history, so you can always go back to a point in time. Or let's say you wanna know what the differences are between development and production, or when you're working on the next version, you wanna kind of tag your code. Let's say one is for release, one is for development. So you need a source control. So nowadays the most popular source control system is Git, right? Git is the open source actually source control, but then a lot of organizations took Git and kind of made it a kind of a commercial products, right? So for instance, GitHub is a popular one. They kind of give you Git by itself is like a command line entirely, right? But then they added tools on top of that, which is where GitHub was born, also Bitbucket and other ones like that, which kind of give you additional functionality. And these days, if you are in an organization, most likely you want to get on one of these services, right? Azure has one as well. And most commercial products or larger companies have this. Like AWS also has this, but Bitbucket, GitHub are probably a couple of the most popular ones. So you want to sign up with them, right? And if you are like a small team or a single developer, I think that a lot of them have free accounts, so you can, first thing you need to do is really get your Git repository somewhere, right? So you can push your code. So anytime you make a change, you push your code. It keeps a version, of your code. It knows what's the latest code, right? What are the latest changes you've made? That's the point. So far so good. So we understand what source control. So let's get to the next step. So now we have our Git repository which contains our code base. Now, how do we really get to the CI/CD? So again, we go back to coding the application, right? We got that part. We've done the coding. Next, we pushed it to the Git repository, right? We have the latest version in our Git repository. So far so good. What's next? So next, to really automate this, right? Even before any kind of CI/CD, I mean, in fact, this is how CI/CD tools were born. Like, if you think about it, naturally, how would you go about automating this deployment process, right? Now that you have source control, anytime you push your code to the source control, that source control Git repository has your latest code. So technically, if someone just monitored that Git repository, and anytime there was a change, it said, oh, there's a change, so I need to do my build and deployment. That's kind of the idea, right? So anytime there's a change to the Git repository, you want to kick off a build, which will kind of create the package for you that you want to deploy. And finally, when the build is done, it creates the final package. And the final step would be, oh, now that I have my package, I want to deploy it to a server, right? So that's kind of the automation, on a high end in terms of taking the code and deploying it and monitoring the Git repository for any changes, right? That's kind of on a higher level. You really want to understand this before really diving into the pipelines and CI/CD. This is on a high level. This is what it does. So it's really important to understand this. There's 4 basic steps. Build your code, develop your application, push it to a source control Git repository, which then something will monitor that repository for changes. And if there are changes, that something will take those changes, create a build and deploy. So far, so good. So next, let's look at the actual detailed CI/CD process. And now that we understand the basics, how do we go about showing the more detailed steps of this? Okay, so let's see what the detailed process looks like. If I can go to my next step here. So again, let's start from coding the application, right? So you code the application, you push it to the GitHub repository or Bitbucket or something else. What happens next? Right now, we're talking about the actual steps, not the higher level. What actually happens when you push your code to a repository? Well, by default, nothing happens, right? If you don't configure it, nothing happens. But what do you want to configure? So GitHub, Bitbucket, and a lot of the other ones offer something called webhooks. You can think of these as events or actions. So anytime there's a code change, you can configure it so that it sends a notification to some other system telling that system, hey, I received a change on this repository if you care about it, right? So, so this way, our CI/CD tool, whether it's Jenkins, GitLab, or something else, we can configure it so that it will kind of listen for those webhooks, right? For those events, for those notifications, because only at that point, it will know that, hey, I need to kickstart another build and go to my pipeline and deploy it to whatever destination is. So it is important to understand this. This is the most best practice way of setting this up. I've seen some organizations there's another way where you could do it, like in Jenkins or GitLab, some other places, there's something called pooling. So if whatever repository you are using does not have webhooks, the second way to implement this is really with pooling. And what pooling does, you can think of it like a job on your CI/CD tool, and it can run every 5-10 minutes. It will kind of query the repository and see if there are any changes. That's the bottom line. So it's gonna look for any changes in the repository, and if it finds a new change, it'll say, okay, now I have a new change, so I'm gonna start my process. But ideally, you do want to configure webhooks, because webhooks will kind of, if you're doing pooling, it'll utilize more resources on your CI/CD systems, because then it's gonna kind of continuously call the API to check for changes, But this way, with a webhook, it doesn't have to do anything. It can just wait until there's a notification from GitHub or Bitbucket. Hey, there's a change. Now you can do whatever you need to do. So that's the bottom line. That's how webhooks work. Okay, so you need to configure this. Actually, it's not enabled by default. You have to configure it, and then you have to configure it and point it to whatever CI/CD tool you're using. So far so good. So what's next? So now that the CI/CD tool, Jenkins, GitLab, they received the webhook, or let's say they were using the pooling mechanism, and there is a change, and only at that point they'll say, okay, now I have a change. Now I need to start my build process, or I need to start this pipeline that I have, and we'll talk about pipelines, right? But technically at that point, it's gonna say, I have a change, now I need to do something about this change. If I care about the change or not, maybe I don't care about the change because, I don't know, it's not let's say you have a Git repository, you're working on a feature, but it's not the dev branch, right? So maybe you can configure your CI/CD to only listen for changes in the master or dev branch. So because not every single commit you might want, to exclude some commits from the deployment, right? So during the day you're developing, you're pushing your code, but not necessarily every single change you want to start the build process on. So anyway, that's kind of the so far so good in terms of starting the build process or the pipeline. So how CI/CD tool works. So now let's get to actual nitty gritty of Jenkins or something else, or pipelines, right? So to really understand what happens when it receives your webhook, or if you are using the second mechanism, which is pulling, it does the pulling, and now there is a change. So I have a change. What am I gonna do now? So after it receives a change, first thing, usually in most pipelines, it needs to pull that change, right? So you need to pull that change from the Git repository to kind of see what the change is, right? To kind of start, now that there's a new change, meaning there's a next version of the application, now you want to start the build process. So first thing you need to do, of course, is get the latest code, so you have the latest version, so you can start your build process. And again, as I mentioned, there's also a pooling mechanism which you can set up to if you don't want to use webhooks. So after it pulls the latest change, next, again, this is a really basic pipeline, right? So let's kind of really quickly go through. I know we talked about this, but one more time, it pulls the latest change into this pipeline. Next, it says, now I have the latest code. Now I know what my build commands are, because you'll configure that in the pipeline. Now I have to go and run those build commands, so it will create a package for me. So once I run those build commands, at the end of the build, it'll create a package, or also known as artifacts in CI/CD language. Okay, so if you hear about artifacts, it's really the produced result of a build. Okay, and finally, I need to deploy. Now that I have my artifacts, I have my package, I need to deploy it to the destination server. And there's multiple ways you can deploy. You can use SFTP, or if it's a local net, if it's on your local network, you can use shared drives or whatever, right? There's a lot of different ways to deploy, but the bottom line is, as you can see, right, going back to our manual process, the whole process hasn't really changed. What's changed is the automation part of things, right? So that's why this CI/CD process, I think, is really helpful to really understand from the manual process. And now that we're getting to automation, the end goal hasn't changed. We still want to pull our latest code, run the build, and deploy, right? But now it's the system is doing it for us. So again, this is the most basic format, right, of CI/CD. And some might say, okay, it's a few steps. Why can't I do it manually? It's not a big deal. But let's and again, I'm mentioning here that this is a pipeline technically, but it's the most basic pipeline, but it is a pipeline, right? It has the essential parts, in other words. So again, it's one pipeline, right? But most CI/CD tools don't just run one pipeline. You don't really manage just one application in the organization. Even if you manage one application, let's see what one application is involved, right? So one application can at least have two environments, right? So dev and production minimum, right? Probably has more in a lot of organizations, but for the minimum, you have dev, prod, you might have test, release, whatever. Now, for each of these, you need a separate pipeline, because each pipeline can only do one thing. And remember how we said you push your Git repository changes, right? And then it sends the webhook. Now, usually in your Git repositories, when you have environments, usually you also have branches for those environments. So those of you who use Git, you know what I'm talking about. So you might have dev branch, or you might have master for production, you might have other ones. So technically, if you're pushing your change to dev, you don't want the production build to kick in, right? You don't want to deploy to production if you're just making a change on dev branch. So if you want to, if you just want to deploy to dev, You basically check out the dev branch, you make your change. Well, that's really a simple way to say it. Generally, in practice, you don't even do that. You create feature branches, which then go through, code review process, a merge process, and all that. I'm not gonna get to those details in this video, but just so you understand, Git. When we talk about versioning, we also talk about versioning of different environments, different releases, right? So at the minimum, you have two environments here, which also means you have two pipelines going on. But now let's see what happens, right? So you have two pipelines. Your dev might have just one server, right? But your production, hey, might have two servers. As you can see, it can easily get complicated now that you're not just deploying to one server, right? If you were doing it manually, okay, now the organization comes to you and says, hey, we need to kind of scale our servers because performance isn't great. Our user base is increasing, so we need to add another server. What happens in that manual case, right? Let's go back. If you go back to that manual case, now you have to create a package and not only copy it to one server, but you have to copy it to two servers. What if we had like 5 or 10 servers, right? As you can see, the manual process will eventually suck for some people. That's why there are actually release teams in some companies, because that's their full-time job pretty much. But anyway, these pipelines, even though they start really simple, over time they can get really complicated. And remember, we call this CICD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Integration means you might also want to run some unit tests or testing before or after your code is deployed. I know again, this is a topic I know a lot of organizations want to implement, only a few actually do, but nevertheless, if you want to run testing or integration testing, at some point in the pipeline, you will have that step that runs the integration testing. Okay, as you can see, your pipeline is getting more complicated now. And finally, hey, you also want to notify the team when the deployment is done, right? You might want to send them email, send them text message or something else. But the bottom line is, or if something failed, you also want to notify the team, right? So as you can see, these pipelines, they start really simple, but they can over time get complicated. They can have many different steps, many different takes on them. But now let's see if we have 3 applications, right? And each of them have their own pipelines. As you can see, this is where our DevOps positions are born, because most developers cannot handle managing this many pipelines. So that's why we have DevOps teams now. However, that's not an excuse for you not to be using CICD. If you can even if you implement the most basic form that we covered here, right? Even if you just implement the most basic form, it's much better than manual. So go ahead and do this. And again, I'll be creating a actual Jenkins step-by-step from beginning to the end tutorial video that's gonna cover the entire setup of all these steps, including the pipeline, and we're gonna see how we push the code and it finally gets deployed to whichever place. So I'll have that coming up. But if you have not subscribed to this channel yet, so stop what you're doing. That's the first thing you need to do, right? I'm gonna pause for a second. Go ahead and click on like on this video and go ahead and subscribe, because you will miss out otherwise. I'll be, again, unfortunately, I don't have as much free time to do videos every day, but when I do want to make sure that it really helps everyone to really understand and increase their knowledge and actually take something and implement, right? This is like a more of a higher level, what is CI/CD, but usually my tutorial videos actually cover in-depth step-by-step guides in implementing something. But also I sometimes want to discuss about jobs or trends in the industry. If you are not following me on LinkedIn, go ahead and do that as well. I do post on LinkedIn more often than YouTube videos. But anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.